For 30 years, Mailman Frank Murphy knew every home security weakness, every street's escape route, and every family's routine while delivering mail. But neighbors never questioned why he gathered this information, or why his observational skills seemed too sharp for an ordinary postal worker. Until that October night, when a gang of professional burglars learned the hard way that some mailmen carry more than just letters. They carry decades of Delta Force training, and when their neighborhood comes under threat, they don't call for help, they become the help. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden warriors, silent protection, and the thin line between ordinary life and extraordinary duty, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and your support helps us share the stories that matter most. Frank Murphy was 68 years old and had been working as a mailman in the Millbrook neighborhood for exactly 30 years, for months and 12 days. Not that anyone was counting, except Frank, who counted everything. Every morning at precisely 5:47 a.m., his internal clock would wake him without need for an alarm. By 6 a.m. sharp, he'd be in his blue postal uniform, checking his old Honda Civic's mirrors and gauges with the methodical precision of someone performing a pre-mission equipment check. His route was sacred routine. 847 addresses spanning 12 streets, starting from Elm Street's morning shadows and ending at Oak Avenue's afternoon light. He averaged 200 households daily, but Frank knew the exact number each day. 196 on Mondays when the Peterson family was traveling, 203 on Fridays when weekend packages arrived for the college students renting the converted garage on Maple Street. The neighbors adored Frank Murphy. Mrs. Anderson, 82 and fighting arthritis, knew he'd walk her prescription deliveries right to her kitchen table, never just leaving them on the porch where she'd struggle to retrieve them. The Johnson couple, newlyweds still figuring out adult life, trusted him to hide their Amazon packages behind a large planter when they forgot to arrange delivery holds. Children called him Uncle Frank and would race to their windows when they heard his distinctive whistling, always the same tune, The Yellow Rose of Texas, though none of them knew why. Even the neighborhood dogs recognized Frank's approach, their protective barking shifting to welcoming tail wags as his familiar silhouette appeared on their doorsteps. What none of them realized was that Frank's kindness served a dual purpose. Every interaction was intelligence gathering, every conversation a briefing, every delivery an opportunity to update his mental database of the neighborhood's vulnerabilities and patterns. But Frank Murphy wasn't just being friendly or thorough. He was conducting surveillance operations, which houses displayed telltale signs of vacation absence, stopped mail, darkened windows, overgrown lawns, which families maintained predictable schedules that could be exploited by someone with malicious intent, which properties had operational security cameras versus dummy units. How many homes relied on old alarm systems with known vulnerabilities, which residents left spare keys in obvious hiding spots that Frank pretended not to notice while making mental notes for future reference. Frank cataloged everything. The elderly widow on Pine Street who always left her back door unlocked during gardening, the tech executive on Birch Avenue whose Ring doorbell had a 15-second delay in motion detection, the college professor on Cedar Lane who posted his travel plans on social media with timestamps and locations. Because Frank Murphy was no ordinary mailman. Beneath the pleasant exterior and postal uniform was an operator who had served 17 years in Delta Force, from 1975 to 1992, known throughout the special operations community by a single word: Ghost. Frank's transformation from small-town Texas boy to elite operator began in 1975 when he enlisted in the Army at age 20. Vietnam was winding down, but the world's dangerous corners were expanding. His superior marksmanship scores and uncanny ability to remain undetected during training exercises caught the attention of recruiters from a unit that officially didn't exist. Delta Force was established in 1977, but Frank had been training with its predecessor unit since 1975. The selection process was legendary in its brutality. psychological stress tests, impossible physical challenges, and scenarios designed to break even the strongest candidates. Out of Frank's class of 150 volunteers, only 8 made it through selection. Frank was number 7. His first deployment was Operation Eagle Claw in 1980, the failed attempt to rescue American hostages in Iran. Frank was part of the advanced reconnaissance team that infiltrated Tehran weeks before the main operation, living in plain sight while mapping escape routes and safe houses. When the mission fell apart in the Iranian desert, Frank's team was already extracted, their intelligence the only valuable outcome of a national embarrassment. After Eagle Claw, Frank's specialty became urban reconnaissance and long-duration surveillance. Grenada in 1983, where he spent 2 weeks living in a bombed-out school building, tracking enemy movements and calling in precision strikes. Panama in 1989, infiltrating Noriega's inner circle by posing as a maintenance worker in government buildings. Somalia in 1993, where Ghost became legend after he spent 72 hours in Mogadishu's most dangerous neighborhood, invisible to both enemies and allies while coordinating rescue operations for trapped rangers. Frank's file contains 17 major operations across 4 continents, most still classified decades later. His specialty wasn't dramatic firefights or Hollywood heroics. It was patience, observation, and the ability to become part of the environment so completely that enemies would walk past him without suspicion. The skills that made him invaluable in urban warfare, reading patterns, identifying threats, moving undetected through civilian areas, proved equally applicable to suburban postal delivery. Every day for 30 years, Frank had been conducting the longest reconnaissance operation of his career, protecting a neighborhood that had no idea they had their own personal guardian angel wearing a postal uniform. Monday, October 23rd, began like any other day. Frank started his route at 7:15 a.m., sorting mail in his truck while mentally reviewing the weekend's intelligence updates. The Harrison family had returned from their Lake Travis vacation, welcome home balloons in the yard. The teenage Morrison boy had gotten his driver's license, new car with temporary plates, and Mrs. Chen's granddaughter was visiting for the week, extra newspapers ordered. His first stop was a Henderson house on Elm Street, a colonial-style home where retired schoolteacher Margaret Henderson lived alone since her husband's death 3 years prior. Frank knew Margaret's routine like clockwork. Coffee on the front porch at 6:30 a.m., morning news until 8 a.m., grocery shopping on Tuesdays and Fridays, evening walks at 5:30 p.m. sharp. But as Frank approached the Henderson property, his trained eye caught an immediate anomaly. The front door stood slightly ajar, approximately 6 inches, with no movement visible in the darkened interior. Frank's Delta Force training kicked in automatically. He stopped his truck 30 feet from the house and conducted a systematic threat assessment. Margaret's 2018 Honda CR-V was in the driveway, unusual for a Monday when she typically stayed home for her standing appointment with her physical therapist. The morning newspaper lay untouched on the walkway, and more critically, the front porch light was still on despite bright daylight. Margaret Henderson never left doors open, never forgot newspapers, and never wasted electricity. In 30 years of mail delivery, Frank had observed her routines with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to enemy patrol patterns in hostile territory. Moving with the fluid caution that had kept him alive in 3 war zones, Frank approached the house on foot. His civilian mind wanted to call out Margaret's name. His operator instincts demanded silence and careful observation. The front door's position suggested forced entry, not violent, but professional. The lock showed microscopic scratches consistent with advanced picking techniques. Inside, Frank's train had detected subtle signs of intrusion, a moved rug, picture frames adjusted by millimeters, drawers that had been searched and carefully restored to near original positions. Frank placed Margaret's mail at the door but added a handwritten note using terminology that would seem innocuous to casual observers but would alert Margaret to potential security issues. Mrs. Henderson, please call regarding yesterday's delivery confirmation. Important timing question. Frank, That evening, Margaret called from her sister's house in San Antonio. "Frank, I've been here since Sunday afternoon helping Linda with her recovery from surgery. What did you mean about delivery confirmation?" Frank's suspicions crystallized. "Margaret, I need you to stay exactly where you are and call the police. Don't return home until you've spoken with Detective Martinez at the precinct. Tell him Frank Murphy recommended you call, and mention that you need to report a possible break-in." When police investigated Henderson House, they discovered a sophisticated burglary. Jewelry, electronics, and cash stolen with surgical precision, but common items left untouched to delay discovery. Professional work by people who understood psychological manipulation and delay tactics. Tuesday brought confirmation of Frank's worst fears. The Jackson family on Oak Avenue. Both parents worked downtown. Kids in middle school exhibited identical intrusion signatures. Frank spotted them immediately. A kitchen window that showed fresh pry marks, barely visible unless examined from the specific angle where his mail truck was parked. This time, Frank didn't just observe, he investigated. Using techniques learned in urban reconnaissance training, he conducted a perimeter sweep of the Jackson property. Footprint analysis in the soft soil beside the house revealed at least 2 intruders, both wearing common athletic shoes with artificially aged treads to avoid distinctive marks. The entry method was identical to the Henderson break-in. Professional lock picking, minimal property damage, and evidence of systematic searching. But this time, Frank noticed something else. Tire tracks in the alley behind Oak Avenue. Fresh impressions from a larger vehicle, possibly a van or SUV. Frank called the Jackson family during their lunch break. "This is Frank Murphy, your mailman. I have some concerns about your property security. I recommend you return home immediately and call the police before entering your house." The Jackson family found their home violated in the same surgical manner as Margaret Henderson's. Valuables gone, but personal items arranged to suggest nothing had happened. Without Frank's warning, they might not have noticed a theft for days. By Wednesday, Frank Murphy had shifted from passive observation to active counterintelligence operations. The Rodriguez family on Pine Street showed the same pre-attack indicators Frank had learned to recognize in his military career. Neighbor schedules being monitored, escape routes being mapped, security vulnerabilities being tested. Frank had identified a professional gang conducting systematic neighborhood reconnaissance, hitting houses with surgical precision during carefully timed windows when families were predictably absent. They were disabling alarm systems, avoiding camera angles, and stealing items that wouldn't be immediately missed. But they had made one critical error. They were operating in a neighborhood protected by someone with 17 years of experience hunting human predators in urban environments. That Wednesday evening, Frank descended into his basement and opened a storage locker he hadn't touched since his retirement from Delta Force. Inside, wrapped in military-spec protective cases, lay equipment that had once made him one of the most effective surveillance operators in the U.S. military. Third-generation night vision goggles, digital audio surveillance gear, GPS tracking devices, and communication equipment that could operate on military-grade encrypted frequencies. For the first time in 30 years, Frank Murphy was preparing to become Ghost again. Thursday and Friday, Frank conducted dual operations, maintaining his mailman cover while executing a comprehensive intelligence-gathering mission targeting the burglar network. His postal route became a surveillance platform, allowing him to observe the neighborhood from multiple vantage points without attracting suspicion. By Friday evening, Frank had developed a complete operational profile of his targets. Primary vehicle, black panel van, older model, possibly stolen or using false registration, observed conducting surveillance drives during morning hours when children left for school and parents departed for work. Personnel assessment, minimum 3 operators. Driver remains with vehicle. 2-person entry team conducts interior operations. Estimated operation time 12 to 15 minutes per target residence. Target selection criteria. Houses with predictable absence patterns, limited neighbor visibility, multiple escape routes, and high value, easily transported items. Operational timeline. active Tuesday through Friday during business hours, avoided weekends when neighborhood occupancy increased. Frank's military experience allowed him to predict their next targets with mathematical precision. The Wilson family had posted social media updates about their weekend camping trip to Garner State Park. The Chun family had mentioned visiting elderly relatives in Houston during their Friday evening walk. Both houses represented perfect targets, isolated valuable contents, and guaranteed 48-hour absence windows. Frank made his decision. After 30 years of civilian life, he would conduct one final military operation, not for country or unit, but for the neighborhood that had become his responsibility to protect. Saturday evening, Frank initiated what he privately designated Operation Neighborhood Watch. Using skills that kept him alive in Mogadishu and Panama, he established observation posts covering both potential target houses while maintaining plausible deniability for his presence. At 10:47 p.m., the black van entered Millbrook neighborhood using the route Frank had predicted, Birch Avenue to Pine Street, avoiding the main thoroughfares with their higher concentration of security cameras and street lighting. Frank tracked their movement using handheld GPS coordinates, plotting their approach route and identifying their fallback positions. 3 occupants, as expected, driver maintaining overwatch, 2-person entry team conducting final reconnaissance before approaching the Wilson house. The burglars moved with professional competence but civilian-level awareness. They failed to detect Frank's presence 50 meters away, hidden in the landscaping of an abandoned construction project with clear sight lines to their operation. Frank allowed them to begin their entry. Delta Force doctrine dictated gathering maximum intelligence about enemy capabilities before revealing position or initiating contact. He observed their tools, techniques, and communication methods, building a complete tactical picture of their operation. When the entry team disappeared inside the Wilson house, Frank moved to execute the first phase of his counter-operation. Using the same electronic warfare techniques that had once disabled enemy communications in Somalia, Frank interfered with the van's electrical system. Not dramatic sabotage, but subtle component failure that would strand the vehicle without creating obvious evidence of tampering. Next, he deployed miniature GPS tracking devices on their vehicle and backup escape route. Techniques learned from decades of hunting high-value targets who had their own escape plans and contingencies. The psychological warfare began when the burglars returned to find their vehicle experiencing mysterious electrical failures. Frank remained invisible, observing their increasing panic as they realized their carefully planned operation was falling apart without explanation. Using night movement techniques perfected in urban warfare environments, Frank began psychological pressure operations, appearing and disappearing at the edge of their vision, creating sounds that suggested pursuit without revealing his position, leaving evidence of surveillance without direct confrontation. Frank allowed the burglars to attempt escape on foot, herding them through the neighborhood, using terrain knowledge acquired over 30 years of daily observations. Every turn they took was anticipated, every escape route was covered, and every decision they made moved them closer to Frank's chosen confrontation site, the dead-end cul-de-sac at the end of Oak Avenue, where their options would be limited and Frank's advantages maximized. When the 3 burglars finally arrived at the dead end, desperate and disoriented, Frank stepped out of shadows. To them, he appeared as nothing more threatening than an elderly mailman in uniform, holding a flashlight and wearing concerned expression. "Good evening, gentlemen," Frank said in the same pleasant voice he used when delivering packages to neighborhood children. "You seem to be having some difficulties tonight." The burglars' leader, a man in his 30s with a lean build of someone accustomed to physical work, laughed with relief. "Just car trouble, old man. We'll be fine." Frank smiled with grandfatherly warmth. "I'm Frank Murphy. I've been the mailman for this neighborhood for 30 years. I know every family, every house, and every person who belongs here." His voice remained gentle, conversational. "And I know that you don't belong here." "So what?" challenged the leader. "You going to stop us, mailman?" Frank's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle transformation that anyone with military experience would recognize as a predator revealing itself. 30 years ago, Frank said quietly, I wore a different uniform, Delta Force, call sign Ghost. The transformation was immediate and complete. The kindly neighborhood mailman disappeared, replaced by an operator who had survived 17 years in the world's most dangerous places. Frank's voice remained calm, but it now carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. Here's what's going to happen, Frank continued. You're going to return every item you've stolen from this neighborhood. You're going to leave Millbrook and never return. And you're going to remember that this community is under protection. The burglars tried to maintain their bravado, but Frank began demonstrating knowledge that shattered their confidence. Their van's license plate number, their faces captured on his personal surveillance equipment, their exact operating procedures, and detailed descriptions of items stolen from previous break-ins. I spent 17 years hunting people like you in places where there were no police, no backup, and no rules of engagement, Frank said. Tonight, you have advantages I never gave my other targets. You get to leave alive, and you get to keep your freedom. But those advantages expire if you ever threaten this neighborhood again. The encounter ended not with violence, but with the overwhelming psychological pressure of facing someone whose competence vastly exceeded their own. The burglars returned the stolen items to the Wilson house, abandoned their disabled van, which Frank had recorded approaching the neighborhood, and disappeared into the night with a clear understanding that Millbrook was permanently off-limits. Frank followed them to the neighborhood boundary, ensuring their departure while maintaining surveillance protocols that would alert him if they ever returned. Only when he was certain they were gone did he return home, carefully storing his equipment and resuming his civilian identity. Monday morning, Frank Murphy was back to his regular routine. Blue postal uniform, friendly smile, and the same careful attention to detail that had protected his neighborhood for 30 years. When neighbors thanked him for keeping an eye on things, Frank simply smiled and said what he'd always said, just doing my job. But Frank Murphy knew that some responsibilities never end. His 17 years in Delta Force had taught him that protection duty is not a job. It's a calling that lasts a lifetime. The Millbrook neighborhood returned to its peaceful routine, unaware that their mailman had just conducted one of the most successful civilian protection operations in the history of postal delivery. At the Human Stories, we believe that heroes hide in plain sight, wearing ordinary uniforms and living extraordinary lives of service. Have you ever met someone like Frank? Someone whose ordinary job masked an extraordinary past? Share their story in the comments below, because every community deserves to know about the guardians walking among them.